Everybody. I'm Jouelzy. I'm the founder of the SBG Book Club, and I am here with T of the Black Queer Book Club. They are coming to us from Ireland. Do I have that right?
Yeah.
Is Ireland still part of the UK? You guys part of Brexit?
Oh, we started here. No, just the north would be part of
Okay.
the UK.
I don't know. We don't learn a whole lot about Europe, like modern
Yeah,
Europe history. I've been out of school for a long time too, so maybe it's been changed.
yeah. I mean, with the American tourists, we know that not much is learned.
Are we that hard? You know what? Interesting. I'm in a black travel group though, and one of the constant discussions is how like Ireland is a really great place for black Americans to travel to.
I mean, I feel like Irish people love tourists, and we like cater to tourists and stuff. But in terms of like the black population in Ireland, like there's still like, discrimination because we live in like global like racial capitalism and stuff. So,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
obviously, it's not to say that there's racism doesn't exist, especially for people that live there, right? Like, I have a great time in Amsterdam, but I also don't live in Amsterdam, so I'm not going to experience as a tourist some of the politics that are essential to like the Surinamese community that lives there or the African community that's based in Amsterdam. But there's a constant conversation about how like just as black folks, we don't think of like, oh, you think of Europe, you're like Paris, Italy, London. Nobody's like, ooh, Ireland, but everyone is always like, Ireland is an amazing country to visit. It's just beautiful.
It's gorgeous. Like I would recommend the West, like the East, not so much, but West, you'll get the views, you'll get the cliffs, you get all that.
I'll have to hit you up if this pandemic ever ends and we can get into it. But to just go
Yeah.
back over it again, this is T. They're representing the Black Queer Book Club. And we are on our third discussion for Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi. And I've just been loving these discussions. I so enjoyed reading a book that I will acknowledge was a little difficult for me to get into. The first five
Yeah.
chapters
Yeah.
was a little, what are we reading? What are they talking about? What is this? Right? But then you keep going, you get into it, and it's just like Akweke just so challenges you in such a beautiful way. She really interrogates your beliefs, your politics, your understanding of gender and sexual identity, and even your understanding of like mental health and how we define who gets to be seen as sane, who's seen as crazy, the way that we have interpersonal relationships with different people. There's just so many things that I was left thinking about that I love this book.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, the first like couple of chapters I was completely lost and like book four, the deadline of like the book club that I had to like host, I wouldn't have made it, but because of that tight deadline, I pushed through and I really do feel like it's the kind of book that you have to read almost like as closely like together as you can because everything informs each other. Like you can't have the second half without like knowing about, the inception of these gods and like the displacement that she felt like from her mother, which informs like the isolation of the entire book. So yeah, I would recommend like the 2-day binge for like, something like Freshwater.
I got it on Audible and I read the physical book, and so that's kind of what helped me. Where's my copy that's behind me? Somewhere. I know I brought it downstairs. Oh, it's right here on my lap. I'm so slow. But yeah, as I keep saying, I did the Audible, which I've completed, and I have a couple chapters left of the physical copy. But hearing it in the author's voice and them adding, those special Nigerian inflections to Ashugara, to St. Vincent, to the brothers, sisters, and the Beast Guys, and all those really added a lot of context and a deeper meaning. So low key I'm reading the book twice because I listened to it and then I'm reading it. But it's just a wonderful, wonderful read. So would you mind giving us a little context of like the Black Queer Book Club and how you guys are structured and hence why you're wearing a mask today and let people know how to find you?
Yeah, so we started the Black Queer Book Club like last August-ish, in association with Black Pride Ireland, which would be the like foremost group for like Black queer representation and rights and politics in Ireland, which was started recently in about 2019. And we wanted a place where if you weren't into kind of the more involved activities of the queer scene, and you wanted a safe space where like other like Black queer folks could commune and chat, you could do that, especially for introverts, because a lot of like queer activity involves like really kind of like bombastic, um, you know, sort of endeavors. Um, and as well, like literature is a way of communing. We know that through library spaces, which we hope to like build one day, um, either digitally or otherwise. We know that for the fact that books are so important in historizing like experiences. And I think that's especially important because Black works are very often not given consideration. So we decided to make a like space where we would only read Black works, Black queer work where we can. So so yeah, like we started it and we're kind of tipping away with our monthly readings, and we're pretty much non-hierarchical because again, this is about community, it's not about egos, which is why I'm wearing a mask, partly because of that and partly because I do not want to out myself on YouTube. Because there is that sort of contentious relationship with being African and being queer, especially expressing disparate gender like identities and stuff like that. So, yeah, I hope I was succinct. I was told I have that problem of not
Oh,
being
girl.
brief.
No. Don't be self-conscious or, self-depreciating. We definitely
Okay.
appreciate you giving us your time and space, especially because we don't want to be participating in outing you. So, and we understand the harm that comes with that. So we really just appreciate you joining us. And we just for everyone that's engaging with us in this discussion, T goes by they them. I'm she her. So we just ask that everyone be respectful of how we choose to identify. And let's just get into the discussion because that's what we're here for. This is the fun part. So, this discussion, yeah, is for chapters 12 through 18, but you particularly wanted to discuss some things about chapter 11, which is when we get into a better understanding of St. Vincent.
Yeah, like I just thought it was so powerful that I wanted to add that to the discussion, particularly because his inception starts at chapter 11 and then continues on like through chapters like 18, 12 to the rest of the book. But I thought you couldn't really talk about like his like his kind of presence within the Ada without talking about the inception. Um, and I just thought it was so fascinating because like he was a direct contrast to the like pronouncedly feminine energy of Asugara,
And
but at the same
threatening.
time, yeah, like, but at the same time, I thought it was so cool that like his masculinity was like a gentle masculinity, but like Asugara, like her femininity was like the aggressive sort of like. So I thought like the sort of um, you know, like mixing and like of and queering almost of those sort of modes was so cool to see.
I mean, I definitely appreciated the challenge it presents because it explores, it both says how do we often describe like a feminine versus a masculine energy. We often define masculine as aggressive. We always talk about toxic masculinity and sort of this seeking domination and power. But in a word to bell hooks, patriarchy has no gender, and there's also forms of where femininity can be weaponized and used in a toxic way, and which is what we kind of get with the Asugara, who not as I don't know. Well, I guess yeah, they do kind of like weaponize their femininity, and more so their femininity through their sexuality, through their prowess, through how they attach themselves sexually to men, and it's Saint Vincent actually shows how this masculinity can be comforting, it can be warming, and in the ways that we often talk about femininity, and we assume that because someone presents as feminine that they are going to embody qualities that aren't necessarily specific to any gender. Like, how did we get to this understanding that to be warm and caring needs to be a feminine quality, and why can't that be understood in a queer non-binary space? Like, why does it have to be defined by gender?
Yeah, no, like I completely agree. I think it speaks to sort of like the multiplicity that the Ada embodies through like Asagara, through like Saint Vincent, and even through like the brother sisters. I really liked, that detail of the brother sisters because like it was both like gendered. These beings were both gendered and like ungendered as well. So like, and I think they sort of inhabit the brother sisters, a space in between, and then you have the sort of like archetypal like Saint Vincent and Asagara and like the ends of those poles. And I thought that was like really cool. As well, like Yeshua represented a sort of
Jesus.
gentle masculine, yeah. Jesus like represented a sort of gentle masculinity as well. Although he wasn't very useful a lot of the time.
I mean, there was a huge commentary on Christianity, and without saying that Christianity was flatly useless or stupid or dumb, or without kind of betraying why people might have an attachment to Christianity. And I think that has a really special context, and you can speak to this, of how Christianity tends to work in the African culture, in modern day African culture, where in particular, and I don't know how this might work for Southern African culture, but particular for like Nigerian culture, there is a strong attachment not only to Christianity or your religion in general, but also to your divination, right? So are you Catholic? Are you Anglican? Are you Pentecostal? And that kind of also being a huge identifier and a way that people value themselves.
Yeah. So that is actually so interesting. Like I think about that all the time. I literally had a conversation with my friend about it the other day, comparing notes on how it works in like Southern Africa and Western Africa. And we kind of both kind of observed that the way Christianity works in these like two disparate cultures is that it works in tandem with kind of the indigenous beliefs. And what you get is a very sort of like a Christianity that can't be like, said to be the same as the one that you would find in the institutions in like Europe, for instance. Like, even though I would be Catholic, um, like the way the Catholic Church operates, like in Zimbabwe, of course you have like, the whole thing of the one true apostolic holy Roman Church or whatever. But even in the incorporation of like dance and the incorporation of drums and stuff, like I think it's a callback to um, you know, where that was done before with like other kind of like gods and stuff. And as well, there's a conflict as well. So a lot of like the indigenous beliefs, um, are very often kind of like stigmatized because of Christianity. And so like a lot of the times these groups end up being like really esoteric and like on the margins, even though originally like they would have been more open with their practices. So it's this weird kind of balance, um, you know, and yeah, like yeah, it's so there's so much to say about that. Like I don't think this call could cover it.
Yeah. So let's just move into chapter 12, and we're gonna
Yeah.
reference the syllabus. If you don't have your syllabus, the Freshwater syllabus is on sale for $4.99 to encourage people to join in on these dialogues. It's wonderfully designed. I'm a fan. I love it. And we're gonna just reference it, but we'll keep on. We'll probably talk a little bit more about religion because, like, as you were saying about how it works with indigenous culture, I think that's what Akwaeke does in this, novel, right? They acknowledge the position, like that it's part of the system, right? It's part of the structure. They don't, what I deeply appreciate is they didn't necessarily feed into this idea that Christianity was simply a faith of the white people, and that's when it came into context, and acknowledged that Yeshua came from a similar ancestral space as the other brother sisters, but that they just had a different mode of operation. And
Yeah, it's a symbiotic relationship
yeah,
like between like these ideas.
I love that word, symbiotic. That's how I would explain the relationships between black women and black gay men. Symbiotic, right? Like we can be very harmful to each other. Um, yeah. So chapter 12 in the syllabus, I'm just gonna read the quote that was pulled out, and it's from page 136, and it said Asugara states. I wanted her to know me well and never feel alone. To always remember that no one could fuck her up as well as me. No one could get her as high as I could. Ada could pretend as if she hated me, but you can't hide the truth. I felt how tightly she held me, how she didn't want to come down or let me go, and how she didn't care about the cold or the pain because she had me. And Wahala, or however you say that, Wahala, I was better than drugs, better than alcohol. She was never sober with me. How do you say that? Say like voila.
I have no idea.
Because I remember hearing this part in the audiobook, so like voila, voila. And I was like, oh, is that Arabic? Whatever. Okay, but to get into the questions and not get stuck on how I mispronounce everything, uh, how have you or anyone you known been in a similar relationship? And how might Ashugara's relationship with Ada influence their relationship and the Ada's relationship with isolation? Is Asugara toxic towards Ada? And what role does Ada play in their addictions?
A lot. So, thankfully, I am fortunate enough that my friends are fortunate to have never like, experienced anything like that. So I can't even begin to imagine like,
I've
how
met someone who reminds me a lot of Asugara. Like, and they also are a person with DID. So I don't know if at the time of writing the book if Okweke was familiar with like the Western understanding of dissociative identity disorder, but it's something that they've more recently talked about and acknowledged that this book was basically about a person with DID. Um, and it's complicated, right? Because also there is the way we talk about mental health in in any society isn't really healthy. And as the beginning of the book kind of notes, for someone to like for the Ada to have such an outward sort of craziness, for lack of a better term, like this outward, like very vulnerable with what they were going through, that the crazier the crazier, the actual crazier type of dealing with way to deal with this is to be saner, right? To present as sane, because in it's cold, it's calculating, it's much more brutal and grotesque, because they can get away with bad behaviors, versus because the Ada was kind of so open with what they were experiencing, people were able to come in and help them overcome or them to deal with whatever it is they were dealing with, even though they did go through a lot of harm in the process.
Yeah, like I agree with like what you're saying. Um Even though like it wasn't the healthiest of ways, like I understand that like, we all have our ways of coping. And I as well was conflicted on the pathologization of that word. The fact that like the West will try and like pathologize like, certain um kind of like phenomenons. Whereas, before, like that would have been relegated to like the cosmological. So I'm aware of that. But there was something about the end of the book where like the Ada mentions a sort of past trauma, and like I really would frequent a lot of like mental health like YouTube. So I'd watch a few like videos on DID, and a lot of it stems from like repeated childhood trauma. And like when at the end, like very quickly and very casually, like they mention,
The
and this like
trauma.
repeated, yeah, happened to me. It like immediately I couldn't erase like the idea of like DID and the fact that Asugara was probably a persecutor, like alter, and like yeah, so but as well I want to be able to like respect like, kind of like Igbo cosmology and not necessarily like jump towards that like, having to diagnose it. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a space to like kind of interrogate the concept that the author is presenting here, because even when we were talking to Alexandra last week, they explained how like Obanji is just a mischievous, like every generation or every family has someone who kind of becomes Obanji, if I'm saying it correctly, and I apologize if I'm not. um and that when this book came out, like it was also challenging some aspects of Igbo and therefore Nigerian culture, because typically the way that they deal with a person who they identify as Obanji is to take them to the church, is to have them sort of exercise through, being really driven into the church. And so because we have this presentation of Yeshua who never materializes, right? And so if we are, and when we ask, is Ashugara toxic to the Ada, the only sort of, brother, sister, or God who presents himself that doesn't feel toxic is Saint Vincent.
Yeah. And like as well, like he plays the mediator role between
Mm-hmm.
like, that sort of persecutor kind of complex and the Ada. So like yeah, like it's not so much a toxic like relationship, but I think it's like a toxic sort of way of dealing with things that it's like almost analogous to a mother-daughter like relationship. Like maybe I'm getting way too, but it's like I feel like the Ada kind of manifested this sort of like almost motherly like relationship that like she didn't have with her own mother because of like
Mm-hmm.
the absence, but it's this kind of like weird metastasized version of like a mother-daughter
But it's
relationship.
it's also like, this is what gets me when like in discussing this book, right? And as you were saying, it is a book that you kind of have to read together, like condense, like don't spread your reading out too long, because again, as you mentioned before, the trauma that they know at the end, right? It's kind of casually just breezed through, like we get this short chapter, and it's like, oh yeah, because my thinking, and I was like, am I being ableist in thinking that DID is often a response to like some constant and ongoing trauma. And not that that makes the person less than, because also, and I do appreciate the way they kind of ended the book though, like the strength in this character, dealing with this and processing it and becoming comfortable in their own body. Is that like, what do you expect when a child goes through, when a person goes through all that trauma? Who are we to then define how they should respond to that? But it's also like, because you don't get to that until the end of the book, it's constantly like, well, how do we talk about Sachi? How do we talk about their mother? Because it's presented as though the brother sisters awoke, and Allah, the originator, decided that the mother had to be removed.
Wow, I didn't like consider like that like before. Like I just like started with the seed of like, Asugara like possibly being this like,
Mother.
mother figure, but like I didn't like relate it back to like the original mother. Like I
I
think
mean, because
that's
they
a
have that
huge
passage in
thing.
chapter 2 where they're like, they literally say the what, I forget the exact quote, but that kind of ends on this note that the best way to break someone is to remove the mother.
Oh, so that might have been like, as well as like the repeated like childhood trauma that I might have like exacerbated, and so like this kind of like mother kind of figure was created out of that from the original like, kind of like wow.
I mean, I think what it does do though is that, like, it also kind of allows you to acknowledge that Sachi was dealing with their own trauma. And so it's not like this black and white. It's not, oh, well, the mother did this to the child, and that's why it is. And so it doesn't necessarily blame Sachi for the things that the Ada goes through, though it kind of gives you space to acknowledge that some of what the Ada does go through is in response to their relationship with their mother and their father, definitely, because a lot of the ways their mother responded to them was because of the lacking of their father. um but that, it's all kind of circular versus here's who caused it and here's who responded.
No, I never like even with it took a second read to kind of like start seeing the kind of the sort of negligent behavior towards the daughter. First read, my first instinct wasn't to blame Sachi. Like I immediately kind of recognized, especially with like black women or women of color, since like the mother is Tamil, I think.
Yeah, Malaysian.
Um, yeah, yeah, but I imagine like it's very much the same with like brown women. The fact that the matriarchs of the family have to like, pull up like for the entire family. So like I kind of had like compassion for that, like the fact that like she had to go away to work, to provide for, the children and like in so doing sacrificed like many years towards that, and was not really capable of the warmth that would have manifested from like physical proximity with the children. Um, so yeah, like I never like blame Sachi because I feel like I understand from like, looking at the matriarchs in like my own family.
Mm. Let's move into chapter 13. So the quote for this is pulled from page 142 and 144. Ada explains to Asugara, I'm trying to protect myself now. I don't need to do that anymore. I don't need you anymore. And so this is, I mean, a lot of this is just going to be our exploration of the Ada's relationship with Asugara, because that is the main spirit. And is Ada closer to a sense of liberation after speaking up against Asugara? How has Ada changed since Asugara was born? And just to continue, because the quote then continues into, Ada then pleads, you're hurting people I love. Don't you understand? I can't just fold my hands and watch you do it. Man. Is this in reference? I feel like this is in reference to Ewan, whose name it's an Irish name. How do you say it?
I would like honestly, there's about 50 ways to say like one Irish name. So I would gravitate towards like Ewan,
Yeah.
but someone's going to tell me I'm wrong. So it's fine.
No,
So yeah, I think it's in response to the treatment towards Ewan, but also it would be response like it's calling back to like much earlier with like I forget like the that brother character. When she like goes to like she stays with the family and like oh anyway, like well basically one of like Asugara's like exploits. So I think it's referring as well to like a pattern of like Asagara's like exploits, like, and not just to like Yun, but I think Yun is the one that like is the straw that broke the camel's back with regards to that.
yeah, because that was a
Um,
person they genuinely loved, and they couldn't fully. The Ada could not fully participate in the relationship because, and I almost want to say that the Ada themselves is asexual.
oh, I never really considered that, but that makes sense.
They
But I
leave their
feel like
body.
yeah, but I feel like as well that was also a response to trauma
Oh no,
and mightn't
absolutely.
necessarily like, be asexual, but because of like the trauma is just cannot like bring themselves. But I never really
PTSD. Yeah.
considered it. Yeah, I never really considered the like asexuality kind of portion of
Because
it.
Saint Vincent isn't like this strongly sexual identity either, right? Like when Saint Vincent inhabits them, they seek just warmth and comfort. It's not like this I need to dominate and pounce and be with all these people in a deeply vulnerable way, but also very cunning.
I would have to disagree because in the dreamscape,
Yeah.
Saint Vincent is very kind of like active and stuff, but can only be active in the dreamscape because like the sort of outer body will not allow him to, manifest himself in the way that like makes him feel actualized.
Yeah.
So I think like there is an energy, but it's a wholly different warm energy to like the kind of burning like sexual energy of Asagara. So yeah, like I like that contrast as well. Um, but what was the question on the thing
Oh, there was
again?
a bunch of questions. What is Saint Vincent's role in that moment between Ada and Asugara? And is Ada closer to a sense of liberation? How has Ada changed since Asugara was born?
Um, I think that the way that the Ada has changed is the fact that they're willing to advocate for themselves more, which is shown with like trying to seek like medical help, and trying to speak up more about St. Vincent. Even though like, there's huge insecurity and like active animosity by Asugara about talking about like St. Vincent and stuff. So yeah, I think being honest about what they're going through for the first time, like they're trying to like remove the veil that Asagara's placed like upon them,
Mm.
which I think is really like empowering. Um, yeah, and that's all I like see. Like that's the kind of most prescient way that I think that she's changed.
Yeah, so like when I think about like the possibility of Asugara being a response to this ongoing trauma, I actually think that Saint Vincent is kind of a growth, like a maturity
Mm.
process.
Yeah, because like it doesn't seem that like Saint Vincent had actually like came up at the like moment of it took a while. And I think that like came with healing
Mm-hmm.
as well. So like and that's kind of like embodied by like the healthy sexuality that he embodies. And as well like I think it also symbolizes like his inception symbolizes the fact that the Ada is closer to realizing sort of like the gender like, question that they've like been dealing with in a passive way all these years. So yeah.
Well, also because like in this, I we're skipping to the end of the book again, but like all their trauma is very much so is gendered violence, right? They are it's
Mhm.
gendered violence as how people perceive they can use the Ada's body because they are a female, right? Or biologically female, born woman, right? So so it makes sense to me that Asugara would come out and be like, all right, well, if you want to use my body, right, as a weapon against me, let me use my body as a weapon against you. Like that makes sense to me that that is how Asugara presents. And that also because they experienced so much engendered violence that they never really that it took a longer time for them to come at peace with their body, because they also note that they had a small chest and they often presented as masculine, and or people would make fun of them or talk to them as though they have this masculine body, but then weaponize the female parts of their body against them. And so that's why I think that like Saint Vincent is kind of, and as you're saying, like, yeah, it's a like Asugara is a representation of the trauma, and Saint Vincent feels much more like a representation of the healing, or that
Yeah.
process towards healing.
Yeah, I think a representation of healing and kind of like because I feel like a lot of the shame that they felt towards their gender was external. Um, and that like Saint Vincent represents kind of the internal that was always there, like, but um obviously like they were shamed out of that, you
Mm.
know. So I don't think it's necessarily that they were kind of embarrassed about like that side of themselves, but they were made to feel like,
Ashamed. Yeah.
so yeah, ashamed of that. So
Well, if we move into chapter 14, Ada tells Ewan that the reason she is crying when they are intimate is because she has never had sex without a mask on. And this is on page 155. So we want to consider the author's overarching themes of vulnerability, isolation, and belonging. How has the Ada utilized other influences or people in her life as a mask? What is the significance of Asugara being the one physically active with Ada's lovers? And do you think Asugara trusts Ewan? And does Ada trust Ewan? These
I,
questions are so like layered. No, Asugara says as much. They do not trust Ewan.
yeah, oh yeah, there isn't like a trust, but I think there is on Asugara's kind of end, like a genuine fondness towards like you because of like the darkness that like he represents, and like that is like, what Asugara symbolizes, So I think yeah, like I think there is that fondness. And I don't know, what do you think? Like,
So, like, I think the Ada wants to trust Ewan, and I think they want to truly love Ewan. Like, I think there's a genuine connection, but I also think the connection is trauma bonding. And this is a thing, right? Because I want to talk about Asugara and the Ada as if they are two very distinct people. But as is constantly referenced, there's no beginning and ending between the two of them, right? And so yeah, Asugara comes in and represents and overwhelms so much so that the Ada probably doesn't remember the moments where Asugara is taking over their body, and that's just the way that identity disassociating works for them. um but also that Asugara is them, and how are they showing up also in their moments of bonding? How, because especially when you are in this deeply sexual relationship with somebody, those moments are going to transcend into how you look at each other, how you talk to each other, how in your moments of not like, what is the sexual tension that you hold with each other outside of the bedroom.
Yeah, I feel like, I don't actually feel like there was ever a connection because, like it was said, like she wasn't ever there. So I feel like if anything, there was more of a connection between like Asugara and Yun, but at the same time, like Asugara and Ada are like one and the same. But I feel like, Asugara is a tool. Like, so I think on some level, since Asugara is a tool, like for the Ada, they did not want to actually connect with like Ewan. Like, because like I
I
feel
think
like
the
there's like
darkness was a
more.
connection. I think that darkness was a motivator for both of them. But because we are so informed, like when we think about partnering, regardless of our gender or sexual identity, we almost all feed into heteronormative understandings of relationships.
Do
And
do we though? Sorry.
no, you don't have to apologize. You can cut me off. Go ahead.
I don't know. I was just like, like being like, queer and stuff like that. I don't know if like, you know, because by nature of like the partnership being queer, I don't know if like, people are able to like, um,
Be
feed into
heteronormative.
like
Yeah, I think
hetero.
there's the idea of who does that. One person is nurturing and the other person is, what would be the word for it, is the business minded person, right? That one person takes care of house and home, the other person finances house and home. That one person is going to be more dominant in the bedroom and the other person is going to be more submissive in the bedroom. That one person is going to have some aspect of masculine energy and the now, not to say that everyone, and I do think we are moving forward and moving out of this, but I think a lot of us have still been socialized that the standard of relationships still falls into a heteronormative pattern of gender roles, of dominant and submissive, of masculine and feminine, and we have to do a lot of very conscious work to break those molds.
Yeah, and I think the reason why I was kind of like, because I do agree with you actually. The reason why I was kind of hesitant is because like, it's like queer like couplings and the idea of like because a lot of like queer couples would like more likely gravitate towards like polyamory and just kind of non-traditional like, sort of like roles and stuff. I think it's kind of the queer conceptualization of relationships has helped free
Mm.
like, like even like hetero relationships.
No, I
So I feel
agree.
like yeah, yeah. So yeah, but like I think yeah, it's yeah, I agree with you too. But continue on with your point. I'm sorry I cut you off.
Oh no, you don't have to. I'm a professional hyphenator. Never apologize for getting your word in. Um, no, because I'm just going back to this point that I think that on some levels the Ada is informed, and and they are like, Asugara is Ada, right? And so that even though that they are one of, like, I think Asugara is so cocky, right? But like, are they legit? You know what I mean? Like, are like, they're not perfect, right? And so like, I think in some level Ada really I think Ada and Ewan had trauma bonding because of that, right? And that, Asugara enjoys this dark side of him. And so therefore the Ada's response to that connection is to build out a bond that's based on this deep dark sex that they have. And so I'm sure they had like good times together in real life, especially because the Ada could constantly say what was going on in their heads, and Ewan was like, "Oh, okay, fine, but let's just keep having this good sex." And so I think there was some sort of desire because of that motivation to like partner in the traditional sense. And so did they, I don't know if they genuinely trusted. I don't know if they genuinely loved the person, but I think there was a desire to get to that place. And when they realized that they just couldn't, then it all kind of came crumbling apart.
Oh yeah, there was no like trust or kind of that's why I say there was no real connection because, at the end of the day, like Asugara left like, there was that like scene where Asugara like leaves, you know, when they're trying to have like a more meaningful like, sexual like connection and like the Ada was like, "Where were you? Like, what's happening?" So that's why I feel like, the fact that Asagara was there throughout their relationship, because we know that, like, the Ada had the power to kind of, ask or like, send away like Asagara. The fact that Asagara was there means that there was a mask, means that like they were not willing to actually open up to you and for like one reason or the other, like be it trauma, be it lack of trust
Mm.
or like something like that.
In the last part, the last question for chapter 14, the quote, I mean, we already discussed the questions, but I just wanted to read the quote, which says, Ewan leaves Ada because of her inability or because of their inability to be completely vulnerable. Asugara admits, the only thing that could have saved them was if I had never existed, if Ada was not divided up the way that she was, if she had been able to control me. And I mean, it kind of like the book is not trying to make clean this idea of what it means to disassociate, what it means to have multiple identities, right? But like, as what is it? There was a quote about the purity of flesh, that when you separate something from the flesh, it people perceive it as pure. And it kind of acknowledges that, because this is a human being, that there's no purity in this, right? That everything is going to be complicated and sort of convoluted, as we all are, because we're all dealing, even if we don't necessarily disassociate the same way that the Ada does, that we are all dealing with just layers of complicated things. So there's no way for us to have like precise responses to everything.
Yeah.
All right. I'm gonna skip the chapter 15 because it was a shorter chapter.
Okay.
We can read the quote though. Ada recounts how their mother worries about things and how they went mad when they were younger. I went mad too young, you see. They couldn't wait to ride me. I only scream on my better days, crippled in meat and hot skin. And I think we had addressed this earlier about like Sachi's relationship and like the response to trauma from
Yeah.
Sachi. So we already covered this. But in chapter 16 on page 167, Asugara highlights Ada and Sachi's comfort with one another, saying, "But sometimes I felt reassured by how familiar Sachi's voice was, by how Ada could pick out her handwriting at a glance, how Ada's own handwriting was often mistaken for Sachi, as if their connection showed in ink." Mm. So how does Ada's relationship with Sachi change in their since they were younger, and does Ada have any other mother figures? And I would say absolutely, because I think Milena is kind of like a mother.
Yeah. I would agree as well. Like obviously I went with my kind of like galaxy brain theory about Asagara kind of being like a mother figure. But I'd
Well,
love to
yeah, I
hear
don't
like
think you're wrong though. I think that's a really salient point, all right? Like,
Yeah.
this concept, because Asugara also wanted to control the Ada as if they were their child.
Yeah, exactly. And like the whole idea of like Asugara constantly being like, I know it's best for you, like it's and almost, like I is this a spoiler from later chapters? But anyway, wanting to bring the Ada over, it kind of reminded me of like, someone like a mother figure, a matriarch wanting to like make its sick child drink this kind of like gnarly, like disgusting medicine, but like that's ultimately good for them
Mm.
and stuff.
Is
So,
it's
yeah,
interesting though, because I like in this chapter, the Ada gets into addiction, which is kind of also represented through Asugara realizing that they were easier to control when they were drinking tequila.
yeah, yeah.
Uh, and then I think this chapter ends with the Ada taking all the pills. Because Asugara realizes that they can control them in this way. And then there's this like, the Obanji spirits call back. Well, this is back in chapter 12, right? Where these Obanji spirits pop back up and they're like, did you forget about us? We are the original, we are your home and you have crossed the ocean. And there's all these nods to what it means as a modern day African person to cross the Atlantic, that their ancestors have crossed in a different journey to America. Um, but that the Asugara is disappointed that the Ada has their wits about them, and makes a call to a friend and tells them that they swallowed a bunch of pills, therefore like hyphening their ability to have a successful, what do they call it, they called it a because this is a trigger warning, this is about suicide, but they called it the splintering.
Yeah. I'm not gonna lie, I kind of like did a cursory kind of read of that scene because
Yeah.
it was very difficult.
I have not read it yet, and I was like listening to it and I was driving and I was like, "Oh." So I haven't gotten to that chapter, so I'm like in reading it, so I'm like, "Dag, do I want to read this chapter?"
I think at least with the audio you can be like pulled along, but like having to read it like, there's like intentionality to like reading something. You can't passively like, read something and take it in. So it's a difficult chapter to read. But but yeah, I just like refer to it as like some sort of passage. Um
Mm. I mean, at this point, the Ada is exploring dating women and realizing that their grief from not even just Ewan, but also I can't say that name, but from Soren and from all these other traumas that have yet to be discussed, is constantly finding them even when they are in better relationships. But it is that relationship that they turn back to tell them that they have done something to themselves that could potentially end their lives. And I mean, so this is like this is why the scene is hard to talk about, because the clarity of this scene, and I'm a person that's always talking about trauma porn. I watched them on Amazon Prime. I don't know if it's out in Ireland yet, but it's constant sort of like trauma and violence happening towards a black family. And it's not that we can't acknowledge the trauma that black people deal with, but like this book does a really good job because we get this really triggering scene around suicide, but there's a relief that is offered because it's also a moment of like clarity for the Ada. Like the story shifts. We've constantly had this Asugara identity who overwhelms, who controls, who dominates Ada. And this is kind of like another birth of Ada into like a new awakening of themselves from this scene. And so it's not just something violent that happens to them for no reason and we have to go through like this really tense scene, but this actually is a big shift in the storyline.
Yeah, like I found that as well, like it wasn't obscene because a lot of it, like, like I was almost expecting the, typical sort of like swelling of passages, and then like they're in a bathtub and like there's like blood everywhere. But no, it was actually, I was really shocked about how, I don't know, it almost felt like, Asugar was passing through some sort of portal. The way like, everything was described. So, but again, like, they are connected to flesh and like, and kind of like attached to flesh, even though they have these like many gods in them trying to like,
Mm.
ascend. So, and I'm glad for it, or else we wouldn't have this book because it's a biomythography. So we need someone to have written this.
It's a very important book. You know, it's interesting. We were so like connecting so much of this book to the ending that like I'm gonna read the quote, but we've definitely already discussed these questions from chapter 17 about Ada's relationship to masculinity and Saint Vincent. But I think this quote is important because it says the Ada pulled a short sleeve T-shirt over the vest and ran her hands up and down the mild curve. It felt like armor, like we were bulletproof, like Saint Vincent was being built up in layers of determined fiber. The Ada wore the binder every day and washed it by hands in her small bathroom sink. Once she made the mistake of putting it in the dryer, weakening the elastic. St. Vincent suffered with each fraction of looseness she had caused, so she was more careful after that.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just like, wow, same. Like, in that passage because like, and the fact that like they wore that binder every day
Mm.
just shows kind of like the need and the dedication because binders hurt. I don't know if you've ever
I
tried
have
one.
no frame of reference for a binder.
Yeah, so yeah, like and finally making kind of physical, like, the sort of like inner manifestation of like themselves. So so yeah, I just that's why I connected to Saint Vincent as well. Like because as well as obviously there is this sort of like the pining and, for some people that is on kind of like a physical form representing kind of like who you are inside. There was also a lot of celebration and calm to like, St. Vincent and just kind of like, you know, just casual expression of self. Like, that one line where like St. Vincent was like, you wanting to like kiss the nape of girls and like, approaching people and stuff like, that kind of confident, expression of like gender and like sexuality. That's what I liked. It wasn't all like, because there's a lot of like, crying and pining and stuff like that in these narratives
Yeah.
that I don't like, but not here.
Yeah, and I was talking about this last week how I really appreciated when the Ada got their boobs removed that like it wasn't that, oh, I need to feed into a Western or societal understanding of masculinity, that I'm going to live in the body that I want to live in. That this is my body. And I get to own this body and use this body and live in this body and treat this body how I want to live in it. And so, every time St. Vincent shows up, it's just joy. like, and
Yeah, like, a lot of the time, because I was expecting, when, he showed up, there would be this sort of like shame attached, but the only
yeah.
shame that was coming was like external shame, Asagaru's shame.
Hmm.
It was never like, his shame. And I really like appreciated that.
Yeah, and I think it also, especially for cisgendered people like myself who might be reading the book, who don't get to have, like, we don't have this personal shared identity with the narrative of the story, but it also it it just gives a lot of humanity. It gives a lot of context. It gives a lot of thoughtfulness about like what, because I haven't had to deal with these things myself, but it's like, oh, this makes so much more sense, right? Because maybe I have been the friend in the past who a friend told me they were non-binary or they were masculine identifying or whatever, and I saw them in a dress and I'm like, oh, okay, you got a dress on, right? And it's like, who am I to make that statement? Who am I to decide the way that they view their gender? And all the ways in which we try to force people back into a binary understanding, even when we claim to be allies, even when we claim to be pro trans or pro non-binary, how we still tend to have these normative standards that we expect people to very neatly fit into. And here's the inner workings of the marble room as to why that cannot be the case.
Yeah, I mean, like for me, I'm pretty like understanding when people like kind of are stuck in the binary because like again, like the binary for the most part in a lot of places like is a colonialist, like structure, and we're all kind of, we all have these ideas of like the the cis het like, patriarchy like engendered into us. So it's not so much like malice, but I think even like with myself, like I have a lot to like learn and stuff like and that especially with regards to like gender and kind of like my kind of like Zimbabwean identity. Um so for instance, like in the language like that, my parents would speak, Shona, there would be no, gendered pronouns. There's no she or he in my language. So it's all about kind of like undoing that sort of cishet, like patriarchal conditioning and trying to go back and like imagine what it might have been like before using kind of like those tools and
Yeah.
stuff.
Well, we're going to end the conversation here. We've been on for an hour. Thank you so much for joining us. If you, for all our audience in Europe, the folks out in Ireland, the international scene, definitely check out the Black Queer Book Club, Black Ireland. They're doing the work, and we really appreciate T's contribution to this discussion. It's so helpful. Next week will be our final discussion with dag, I don't have Portia's last name written in front of me. But we're gonna do a final like overarching discussion of Freshwater. So I hope we've given you all enough time to finish the book. I hope these discussions have been helpful, and we'll close out here. Deuces.
Bye. It was nice talking to you.
Thank